Proceed. Mr. Hunt, go ahead.
Mr. Hall will be giving the closing, and then I'll do the rebuttal closing.
All right.
Madam Chief Justice, esteemed state representatives, we are here today because of a question. At the end of this impeachment trial, if you cannot answer that question in the affirmative, then William Benning must be convicted of the articles of impeachment. Now let's go over what we learned in this proceeding. We first heard from Cassandra Cohen. She testified about talking to Mr. Benning and him stating that he had an unmarked gun that he could use to bring harm upon others. She talked about the Frick Little Teapot incident, which ended in a conversation between herself and Mr. Benning, where he stated that he was sick of working with the DOJ and that he can do whatever he wants until he gets, or rather, still get reelected. We heard her testify Mr. Benning incite a fight with an individual in a strawberry helmet. This is a quote here. "I'm sick of calling the police. They never respond to my phone calls. Time for vigilante Benning." Has never had a similar conversation or conflict with another government official as to that conversation with Mr. Benning. Now, we also heard from Serena McAllison, and she testified she found urine on the interior of the mechanic shop. We heard the questioning from Mr. Benning as to him alluding to him needing to urinate on the floor because the bathroom was out of order. And even under that best circumstance, that is a crime. We also heard from the testimony of Terry Jacobs. He talked about how Mr. Benning provoked a fight at Mosley's and eventually punched several employees, ending with some urination on his car. He testified to how Mosley's had public restrooms that customers were free to use upon request, and that multiple times Mr. Benning was asked to leave the premises. We heard specifically from Mr. Jacobs that the urination incident was a vengeful act taken by Mr. Benning. We heard from the two park rangers, Drake Higgins and Mitchell Rocket. They testified to how Mr. Benning stated he wanted to stab State Representative Endeavor Jackson with a knife. They testified to when request to submit to detainment, Mr. Benning got onto a motorcycle and ran from law enforcement. They talked about how Mr. Benning pled guilty to both uttering threats against State Representative Jackson, as well as evading law enforcement. We further heard from the testimony of Pippi Dupont-Stiles. She talked about how Mr. Benning told herself and Mr. Carpero he was a state representative. How Mr. Benning stated he killed 3 people, and Mr. Carpero was to be the 4th. They talked about how a fight that ensued at the Black Uber dealership was at the instigation of Mr. Benning. She talked about how Mr. Benning would use his contacts with the Department of Commerce and Labor to get her business shut down. She testified specifically under oath that Mr. Benning was planning to use his power as a state representative to get what he wanted, and it came to Miss Dupont-Stiles. We then heard the testimony of Mr. Carpero. He talked about how on several occasions, Mr. Benning told him that, of course, Mr. Benning had killed 3 people and threatened that Mr. Carpero would be the 4th. "You do not know how much power I have," Mr. Benning stated to Mr. Carpero. We heard testimony about the same incident that Ms. Dupont-Stiles testified to at Black Uber. We heard about Mr. Benning initiating a conversation with Mr. Carpero at Mosley's, with Mr. Benning stating he would bring chaos after his impeachment. And then we heard about the phone call between Mr. Carpero and Mr. Benning, including Mr. Benning's hit list. We heard how Mr. Benning planned to take out Cassandra Cohen, Cole Gordon, and Harvey Ross. I quote, "I am going to skin Cole Gordon alive." That's from Mr. Benning himself. He stated he would wait until after the impeachment to initiate his hit list. He talked about needing to form a hit squad to go after these individuals of the government. We then heard from the testimony of William Benning himself. He first stated in his testimony that he unequivocally did not state that he was going to skin Cole Gordon alive or that he was going to target members of the DOJ. We then heard in the rebuttal evidence a recording of Mr. Benning stating that he wanted to kill all of the members of the DOJ and that he wanted to skin Cole Gordon alive. We heard that in the recording. We also heard previously Mr. Benning stating unequivocally, right there on the stand, that no, he did not say that. The reason for this, the reason that Mr. Benning said no, I did not do that, say that, is because he at that point did not know that there was a recording. He had the intention to lie to this court during his testimony in order to get away with this criminal activity. During his testimony, Mr. Benning was convicted of perjury. We know that Mr. Benning's testimony is not reliable in the slightest and should be disregarded in its entirety. Overall, we heard a pattern of behavior from Mr. Benning. Pattern of Mr. Benning threatening other individuals, assaulting other individuals, battering other individuals, and acting in a way that is not becoming of an elected official. No reasonable excuse or justification has been provided by Mr. Benning in regards to his conduct. Even if he gave such justification, you should not believe a convicted liar. I would like to reflect for a moment on the state's constitution, the highest legal authority in this state. More specifically, I want to analyze the Constitution's preamble. I'm going to quote here for a moment. "We, the people of the state of San Andreas, grateful to democracy for our freedom, in order to secure and perpetuate its blessings, do establish this Constitution." Very clearly outlined in this preamble is the reason as to why the framers wrote a constitution in the first place. That reason is democracy. Again, I'll reiterate, grateful to democracy for our freedom. In order to secure and perpetuate its blessings, do establish this constitution. Now, our framers decided upon a republican form of government. A form of government in which the people would be embodied through their politicians elected to run our government. Democracy can be the most fragile system of government. For instance, we need to look no further than South Sudan, one of the world's newest recognized countries, organized as a democracy only to become a failed state within a few years. And at the same time, democracy can be one of the most resilient forms of government. Again, look no further than this country, the United States of America, for the perfect example. Well, you may ask, how does this all relate to this impeachment? And the answer is simple. In order to have a functioning democratic government, you cannot have lawlessness. You cannot have incompetent or negligent representatives. And you certainly cannot have corruption. For a democracy to function, you can only have elected officials that are the best of the people they represent. Officials that will put their own desires below the people they serve. In this case, William Benning is the enemy of our democracy, the democracy our framers wanted to protect so very much. Through the evidence and arguments presented today, it has been shown that Mr. Benning is guilty of all articles of impeachment, that on several occasions Mr. Benning has attempted to or has broken the law, that Mr. Benning acts with no regard for his actions, what they could mean for himself or those around him, and that Mr. Benning believes he is above the law. I asked a question earlier that is at the center of this impeachment. In his conduct, did William Benning exemplify what an elected official must be? After hearing all of the evidence, the answer is clear. No, he did not. When the vote is called, we ask you to cast the vote that is due in this case. A vote to protect our democracy, a vote to hold Mr. Benning accountable for his actions, a vote to establish that Mr. Benning's conduct cannot be allowed and cannot repeat. We ask you to convict William Benning on all articles as charged. Thank you.
Mr. Hunt?
Sorry, Judge, I was going to give the rebuttal closing after the defense.
Okay. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thank you. May it please the court, opposing counsel, and the state representatives. On the 3rd day of November in the year 2021, Mr. Benning was arrested by the park rangers for a warrant issued baselessly by the Department of Justice, accusing Mr. Benning of charges that had no physical evidence to support them. This arrest subsequently allowed the state representatives to file impeachment charges on said warrant. This warrant, despite having no physical evidence attached, also had many inconsistencies within statements. Now, although the circuit court has dismissed Mr. Benning's criminal proceedings, it seems as though the state representatives are steadfast in pursuing this impeachment in which the articles are based directly from the inconsistent arrest warrant, which has no basis in fact. We've heard testimony from a plethora of witnesses who have all allegedly stated Mr. Benning did something. However, despite these witnesses, there is still absolutely no physical evidence which proves Mr. Benning committed any of these said crimes. Now, touching back on the articles of impeachment, they were introduced to the House on the 3rd of November 2021. The same articles were then voted on the 6th of November 2021. That is only 3 days between being introduced and being voted on. This, at the time, violated House Resolution 25, which stated all bills and resolutions must have a 77-day waiting period before being voted on. This further proves that the current state representatives and Mr. Benning's former co-workers were completely disregarding the laws to fit their own agenda. In this case, we've seen the same 4 state representatives introduce articles, vote on said articles, and now the same state representatives that originally impeached Mr. Benning are the ones deciding his fate. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I would rather not have the same 4 individuals being my judge, jury, and executioner. Mr. Benning has been the victim of constant harassment. From the beginning, corners were cut, the game was rigged, and Mr. Benning's Fifth Amendment rights were completely disregarded. We ask not only the state representatives to take the lack of pure evidence into account, however, all members of the gallery, as well as those who are watching at home, to take the circumstances of this incident into account. All the state has really provided is a recorded phone conversation stating he wished to harm these individuals. At no time, nor can the state prove that Mr. Benning carried out or acted upon any of these loose threats towards these individuals. The defense rests.
All right. Mr. Hunt?
Madam Chief Justice. Distinguished State Representative. I was thinking here how to respond to all of those arguments. Something that would lay the case out clearly for you. Make it a lot more easier for you to understand. I think this just sums up the case in its entirety. So this is the last time you're going to hear this.
We're going to kill some DOJ members.
Oh, yeah?
You going to rat me out?
Who are we gonna fucking kill?
All of them.
That's a lot.
I'm going to skin Cole Gordon alive myself.
Mr. Hunt, get to the point. I already said enough of the recording.
Sometimes in law, we have a saying. And the saying is that the evidence speaks for itself. All of the arguments offered by William Benning have one fundamental thing in common. One, they have nothing to do with whether or not, factually, whether or not William Benning did these actions. They've given you a lot of distractions. so they don't have to defend what happened on each and every one of those days. And they do that because they believe those distractions are going to work. They believe that you'll ignore William Benning's conduct instead of confronting it. I think they're wrong. We humbly ask you, we urge you to convict William Benning for the crimes for which he is overwhelmingly guilty of. Because if you don't, if we pretend this didn't happen, or worse, we let it go unanswered, who's to say it won't happen again? State representatives, this can't be the beginning. It can't be the new normal. It has to be the end. And that decision is in your hands.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. State representatives, this will be your time to determine whether or not you want to impeach Mr. Benning. Keep in mind that this state is a two-party consent state. However, like I stated to the lawyers here, that some sense of privacy is foregone when you are in a public place. Keep that in mind when you're creating your decision. Mr. Benning, you will, again, like I said, be charged with perjury, and I will still determine on that time frame that you will be getting for that. With that being said, state reps, I will dismiss you to my chambers to decide. Court will be in recess until 11:30.